So in order to make this final section, make sense, I have to do kind of a review of basic Marxism, right? So Marxism views history as a train speeding forward. First you have hunter-gatherer civilization, then from that you get the slave empires, Greece, Rome, Egypt, etc. Then from that you get the rise of feudalism, and then from feudalism bursts forth capitalism, and then the idea is that socialism will be the next stage, which will eventually lead to the stage of communism. And communism, the idea of communism, is a society in which there's so much material abundance that people will be able to live lives without any coercion, where, from each according to his own ability, from each according to his need. There'll be so much stuff that the need for anyone to hoard anything will kind of go away, the need for jails and prisons and things like that will go away, and that there'll be so much abundance. And Marx documents in his book Capital that capitalism, under capitalism, abundance creates poverty, right? The more effective it becomes to produce goods, the more goods you produce, more people are unemployed, right? There's the story of the coal miner, right? Who's his son is in the house and they're freezing cold, and he says to his father, "Why are we so cold?" And he says, "Because I lost my job in the coal mine." And he says, "Well, why did you lose your job in the coal mine?" He says, "Because there's too much coal." Right? And that's the problem of capitalism. And that capitalism leads to this situation where as technology develops, people become poorer. And that's the problem with capitalism. And so socialism is when the banks, factories, and industries, and the major centers of economic power are organized to serve public good and not profits. And so the surplus of society can just continue to go up. And as a result, we can get closer to that final goal of communism. That's basic Marxism. And, Marx thought socialism would come in the first world first. Well, it didn't. It was countries that were kept chronically poor by Western capitalism and imperialism that developed socialism. And one of the main things socialist governments have done in history is industrialize and raise living standards in developing countries. For example, not only the Soviet Union became a world industrial superpower, electrified with socialism. China has become, at this point, the second largest economy in the world with socialism, but it was socialism that built the huge power plant and electrified Egypt under Abdel Nasser. It was the Soviet Union and Egypt that built it, right? And that there are many great construction projects, that the goal of Marxism has always been to raise the level of productive forces, right? And the idea is you can get closer to this final goal of communism by raising the level of productive forces. The more material abundance exists in society, the closer you can get to communism. Well, the Gang of Four, which was a faction in China that came into power after the death or the disappearance of Lin Biao, which is kind of unexplained. I guess Lin Biao, this general, tried to kill Mao, or it's not exactly clear what happened, and he was on a plane, and there's a plane crash, and Lin Biao, the author, the person who put together the Little Red Book, he goes out of leadership in China. The Gang of Four come into power. And one of the key points the Gang of Four makes is that you can transition to a higher stage in poverty, basically arguing that you can get to communism without raising the level of productive forces. That as long as you have an egalitarian revolutionary line, that you can get closer to communism. And they declare China in 1970 to be the most advanced toward communism in all of human history. And at that point, I will mention that a leader named Pol Pot in Cambodia took that argument to another stage. Pol Pot eventually took power in Cambodia, and Pol Pot declared not only could you transition to a higher stage in poverty, but that Cambodia didn't need to industrialize, that they could have agrarian socialism, and that they could have socialism on the basis of an agrarian economy with no industry. The Gang of Four also began speaking of what they called Soviet social imperialism. And that was the idea, Mao, Lin Biao had been very critical of the Soviet Union. They thought it was revisionist, was selling out the revolution. The Gang of Four took it to another level. And they said the Soviet Union are imperialists. They're just like the United States, just like the Western capitalists. They're the Soviet social imperialists. The first country where we saw China start to collaborate with the United States against the Soviet social imperialists was Angola. In Angola, you had the MPLA, which was one of the main communist groups that was resisting the Portuguese, and the CIA was fighting against them, and China started sending its forces to Angola to fight against the Soviet Communist Party, the MPLA. That was in 1969. 1973, you had China embrace Pinochet, right? Because Pinochet had overthrown Salvador Allende. Salvador Allende was the socialist, was seen as a puppet of the Soviet social imperialists. He was overthrown. Haile Selassie in Ethiopia, kind of a, was a leader, the emperor of Ethiopia, had been aligned with the United States. you know, China very much embraced him. And the Gang of Four also started having rallies at the North Korean border against North Korea. And they called Kim Il-sung a fat revisionist pig because he was neutral between the Soviet Union and China. And the Chinese foreign policy began to change. And what's important to note about that is that at the same time, you know, as China's declaring and the Gang of Four are declaring that China can be socialist without having economic growth, no growth politics is starting to become popular in the United States and among leftists. Right? You know, the CIA, at the point, they had a program called the Congress for Cultural Freedom, where they were funneling money to left-wing groups. They funded money. They actually set up a Trotskyite magazine called the Partisan Review. And it was all paid for by the CIA, but it was promoting a lot of people who were very big names among American leftists now, like Susan Sontag, and I think Noam Chomsky was published in Partisan Review. And the Frankfurt School, which was a cultural criticism school in Germany, had originally been aligned with the Communist Party that kind of became independent. There was a lot of funding that they covertly received, and that there was a left that was getting funding from Western capitalist intelligence agencies, and one of their big differences is that they didn't believe in economic growth, right? And they talked about a post-industrial United States. And if you read like Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin's writings, they almost envision the United States becoming less industrialized, right? The idea is, well, we're going to leave the cities with their big authoritarian factories. We're going to go farm in the countryside. And you know, the Dalai Lama had been somebody who China had fought against, but suddenly in left-wing circles, the Dalai Lama becomes very popular. Tibetan Buddhism and some of these Eastern religions become very popular. The Hare Krishna movement, which is a religious sect in India that is very, very right-wing, right? Probably really the enemies of the communists in India. They're really popular at anti-war rallies, and a lot of these young activists who want to become revolutionaries and are protesting the Vietnam War think the Hare Krishnas and Eastern mysticism is really, really beautiful.
They were heroin dealers.
And so in this context, right, where the left in the USA is starting to embrace the idea that growth is a bad thing, there's one example I want to give of this, which is fascinating to me. So the 100th anniversary of Lenin's birth is taking place, right, 1970. And there's going to be celebrations on every continent all over the world. And it was on the 100-year anniversary of Lenin's birth that the first Earth Day was held in the United States. And so all the leftists and Marxists weren't celebrating Lenin's birth, they were celebrating Earth Day. And Earth Day was declared to be a holiday by the US government, and it was a big distraction. While the rest of the world was celebrating Lenin's birth, American leftists were having an environmental rally, and the American media just seemed to not notice all the people celebrating Lenin's birthday. Fascinating, I think. But, you know, the Revolutionary Youth Movement, too, which was this faction of SDS that rejected the weatherman's ultra-leftist violence, they have the idea that they're going to form among the broad masses of American people a new communist party. And the way they're going to do that is they're going to get jobs in factories, and they're going to work in factories and convince their fellow, you know, workers of communist ideas. And immediately, Revolutionary Youth Movement 2 starts to splinter into different groups. Bob Avakian is out of the Bay Area, and his supporters eventually form the Revolutionary Union, which becomes the Revolutionary Communist Party. A guy named Mike Klonsky, whose father was a prominent leader of the Communist Party USA in the past, he starts the October League, which eventually becomes the Communist Party Marxist-Leninist. There's something called the Asian Study Group, which is Asian Americans who are sympathetic to Marxism and communism. They eventually become the Communist Workers' Party. A lot of activists in Detroit eventually merge into something called the Communist Labor Party. And there's different communist groups that are forming. And these groups, they're getting jobs in factories, and they're the new communist movement. And they're trying to build communism in working class neighborhoods. And in Detroit, the new communist movement is quite successful, I would say. You know, there was black auto workers felt they were being discriminated against by the United Auto Workers Union. So they formed something called the Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement, or DRUM. And you know, they would protest outside the convention of the UAW, chanting, "We finally got the news of how our dues are being used. We finally got the news of how our dues are being used." And they were very much a communist faction of the UAW union. And there was a communist judge who was elected in Detroit who took the American flag out of his courtroom and quoted Mao on the bench. Eventually, towards the end of the 1970s, Coleman Young is elected mayor of Detroit. And Coleman Young had been a fellow traveler and friend of the Communist Party USA. He was very friendly with all the new communist movement groups. Wasn't a member of them, but he ran on a platform of abolishing a section of the police force called stress, which stood for Stop the Robberies and Force Safe Society. It was like a brutal SWAT team that was really hated among the African-American community. He ran on a platform of abolishing it, and he won. And he was very much considered to be kind of an ally of the new communist movement. He was elected in Detroit. And in Georgia, there were some walkouts and wildcat strikes. 1974 in Detroit, you had Wildcat Summer, where a lot of these new communist movement groups were leading workers to go out on strike without the permission of the union. It's called a wildcat strike. And so there was some modest success, but for the most part, and this must be emphasized, for the most part, the overwhelming majority of the U.S. public had no interest in these groups. There was a feeling that the U.S. economy had been booming. These are just a bunch of rich kids who need to get a haircut, and there was just not an interest in the new communist movement. And the new communist movement is constantly wrangling with what are we doing wrong. And there's harsh polemics among them. And I also want to mention, at the time, China is starting to change. 1970, Edgar Snow visits China, right, for the last time. And he interviews Mao for the last time. He does the final interview with Mao. When he gets there, though, they take him around, and they take him to one of the universities where they're having struggle sessions at the university. And he sees young people get up and confess thought crime, basically, in front of groups of people. I had a counter-revolutionary thought the other night. I was thinking bad things about Mao. I'm so sorry. And Edgar Snow is kind of disturbed by this. This has taken on a character that he doesn't like. And Zhou Enlai, who is the person who arranged for him to interview Mao, he meets with Zhou Enlai, and he's asking Zhou Enlai, and Zhou Enlai very subtly says to Edgar Snow, he says, well, one of the things that Chairman Mao always taught us was that it was important to win people politically with arguments and not with violence. And it's understood that Zhou Enlai is very carefully and quietly telling Edgar Snow that that was not what was happening in China at that time. During the Cultural Revolution, it was with violence that people were being physically intimidated. 1972, Richard Nixon visits China. And this is at a time where Nixon can't go to any city in the United States without there being a massive protest. But he's welcomed to China as a hero. And China takes its foreign policy to another level. Not only are the Soviet Union social imperialists, the Soviet Union are the main danger to the people of the world, right? And that they are more dangerous than the US imperialists. That becomes the foreign policy. And at the time, Nixon is meeting with Mao, and there's talk of US-China relations expanding. And Nixon is following the strategy of Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger is, a Rockefeller creation largely. He's a strategist. And he's basically arguing he sees the divide between China and the Soviet Union, and he's saying, well, we can use China as an ally against the Soviet Union. And he's trying to carry this policy out. But it's very controversial. Even among Republicans, Nixon is widely denounced for having relations with China. And in fact, the John Birch Society starts distributing bumper stickers everywhere with a picture of a syringe. It says, cut off China, and repeating this lie that somehow China is responsible for the global heroin trade, right? And, China is very sympathetic to Nixon. They see him as a guy who understands and wants to open relations with them. However, the US Marxist movement hates Richard Nixon and thinks Richard Nixon is a fascist. And, the Revolutionary Communist Party, or I guess their predecessor, the Revolutionary Union, they're supposed to be the China-aligned party, but they formed something called the Workers' Committee to Throw the Bum Out, and are having national protests calling for Richard Nixon's ouster. Now, some of the other groups were closer to what China was saying, but it seemed to be contradictory. While China was seeing Nixon as their potential ally, someone who would open trade with them and get them out of the mess, the U.S. Marxist groups see Nixon as he must go, he must be driven out. It's kind of a contradiction. China announces the three worlds theory. And it's this belief that there are two imperialist countries, the USA and the Soviet Union. There's the second world, which is Western Europe, and then there's the third world, and that China is going to lead the third world in industrializing. And another incident happens in 1974. It's called the Glass Snail Incident. And it's a group of Chinese engineers from the 4th Ministry of Machine Building. They come to the United States, and they tour a factory where they're making color televisions. And at the time, you have to remember, there was an embargo against any technology going to Eastern European socialist countries. And so these color televisions are being made in the United States, and none of the countries in Eastern Europe have them. And so these engineers come up with the idea that China will, set up a joint venture with the American company that makes color televisions. They'll make color televisions in China, and China can sell them across Eastern Europe. And this is a way China can make money, because American companies can't sell color TVs to Eastern Europe. People in Eastern Europe would like to watch color TV. It's this idea. And so, to seal the deal, the American company gives all the Chinese engineers a glass snail. It's just kind of a gift, right? And so they come back and they've announced, we've got this deal that China is going to start making color TVs. So Mao's wife, who's one of the Gang of Four, hears about this, furious. She goes and visits the factory, has a press conference at the factory denouncing this and saying that the glass snail is an insult, that this is an insult, this is a mockery of China, and that China would never want to make a Western decadent item like a color television. It was disgusting to even suggest it, and basically destroys the whole deal. And so China doesn't start making color TVs. And Zhou Enlai steps in and says he was going to carry out an investigation, comes to the conclusion the glass snail is not an insult, and basically saves these students from suffering even more. April 9th, 1974, Nixon resigns. He resigns from the office of the presidency. And again, Nixon was being thrown out, and many of the voices denouncing him were not, low-income voices, but some of the most prominent and powerful voices in U.S. society seemed to be very critical of him. Nixon had escalated the Vietnam War with a massive bombing campaign, but then when it was clear the USA wouldn't win, he also arranged for the USA to withdraw from Vietnam. Nixon had also, at one point, even advocated a universal basic income for American citizens, and he had told the FBI to take the gloves off and go after the civil rights movement very viciously and destroy the Black Panther Party. And Nixon was kind of a Bonapartist. He was a representative of the ruling class, of his own faction in the ruling class that was violently asserting its will over others in order to end the political crisis. There was this political crisis in the United States of urban rebellions among the African American community, of campus anti-war protests, and Nixon was becoming kind of an authoritarian strongman who was trying to resolve the crisis. And he was driven out of office in 1974. And China was not happy that Nixon was driven out. They felt like Nixon being driven out made it harder for them. And 1976, you have the bicentennial celebrations in the United States, the 200-year anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. So the Revolutionary Communist Party has a slogan, "We've carried the rich for 200 years, now let's dump them off our backs." And they have a rally in Philadelphia to counter the celebrations. And it's quite massive. It's probably the biggest thing that organization's ever done. I mean, it's 5,000 people attend, great slogan, and there's a famous photograph that comes from that march of a group of Vietnam veterans. They're marching behind a banner that says, "We won't fight another rich man's war." And at that point, a lot of members of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War were members of the Revolutionary Communist Party. And interestingly, who started Vietnam Veterans Against the War was John Kerry, actually. And he left it after a year, but after John Kerry was out of it, it became very close to the Revolutionary Union and the Revolutionary Communist Party. I think that's a fascinating anecdote. But also there's another march, in addition to the RCP's We've Carried the Rich for 200 Years, the October League and some other groups, they have a march called Bicentennial Without Colonies, and the Black Panthers are there and others are there, and it's kind of a rally against American imperialism on the anniversary. And you can see that even though the new communist movement is kind of on the margins of U.S. society, they have an impact. For example, there's a movie from this time called Car Wash. I don't know if people have seen it. And in that movie, though, it's about a group of friends who work at a car wash, young African Americans, and the guy who owns the car wash, his son, shows up one day with the little red book and wearing a T-shirt with Mao's face and is trying to organize the students or the workers at the car wash to be communists. And if you ever watched the movie Network, which is about the 1970s, you can kind of see that this was something that was in the culture. The knowledge of the new communist movement was very, very widespread. So January 8th of 1976, Zhou Enlai died. And Zhou Enlai had been on the Long March with Mao and all of this, and he had been someone who would step in to protect intellectuals and such. And when he died, there was an episode of mass rioting following his death, where a lot of young intellectuals, teachers, scientists, engineers went out and had an anti-communist riot because they had seen Zhou Enlai as kind of their protector from the Gang of Four. 1976, September 9th, Mao dies, right? 1970, after that, Deng Xiaoping takes power and announces that the Cultural Revolution is over, and he arrests the Gang of Four for counter-revolutionary crimes. And 1978 marks the beginning of the reform and opening up, in which he starts creating free market zones. He famously proclaims, "Poverty is not socialism, but to be rich is glorious." And it's also important to note that in 1978 you have the Kampuchea War, and that's, the USA has withdrawn from Vietnam, right? And in Cambodia, the Communist Party is divided between supporters of Pol Pot, who doesn't believe in industrialization and saying agrarian socialism, and supporters of mainline Marxist-Leninist communism. Pol Pot supporters are slaughtering the mainstream communists, so Vietnam invades Cambodia to try and protect their allies in Cambodia. At that point, then China invades Vietnam to protect Cambodia from Vietnam, and you have a situation where communists are killing other communists, right? I mean, it's you know, the Vietnamese communists are fighting the Chinese communists, and the Cambodian communists are killing other Cambodian communists. It's now been well documented that the USA was covertly funding Pol Pot, and that all kinds of weapons and financial support was going to Pol Pot as he was killing the communist wing of his own party. And you know, this culmination where you have a war between with China invading Vietnam and a lot of death. And it's interesting because one of the defenses of the Vietnam War that you'll get from right-wingers is they will constantly say, well, look, after the USA pulled out of Vietnam, it was a bloodbath. Oh, you know, the communists killed far more people. Well, that was because of covert US efforts to manipulate communists against each other. And that was the reality. And that, yes, the military-industrial complex and the mass bombing hadn't worked. So Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski had developed soft power strategies of manipulating communists against each other and covertly funding that. 1978 is also the year where the Italian Communist Party and the Spanish Communist Party and the French Communist Party have a convention and denounce the Soviet Union. And Zbigniew Brzezinski proclaims that these are Euro-communists, and the United States likes Euro-communists. It just doesn't like the Soviet and Chinese communists. And what's interesting about that is that there was probably covert efforts by US intelligence to make that happen. And it's actually Zbigniew Brzezinski himself who coins the term Euro-communists. Jimmy Carter is remembered as the peace president in the US media, right? The only president we've had who never goes to war. Well, he actually started a war in Nicaragua against the Sandinistas. He started the Afghan war against the Soviet Union. And basically, he was working, he called himself a student of Zbigniew Brzezinski, and the idea was to carry out soft power manipulation within the socialist countries. And the way that was done was by courting these intellectuals, these young intellectuals who felt trapped, right? In all the socialist countries, you had a layer of people who were well educated. Often they were the children of the party elite, and they were frustrated. They were frustrated they couldn't make the kind of movie that they wanted to make. They had to have government censorship. They were frustrated they couldn't make more money. They were frustrated that they couldn't drink Coca-Cola and listen to Beatles music. And that layer had real grievances against socialism in Eastern Europe, and Brzezinski's entire career had been figuring out ways to influence those younger people. And as you get up into the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, a lot of the people marching to bring down East Germany or bring down Czechoslovakia or even to support Yeltsin in the 1990s, a lot of them believed that they were not marching to restore capitalism. They believed they were fighting for a more democratic form of socialism. There's a book published in the 1980s by Marilyn Ferguson. It's called The Aquarian Conspiracy. And it describes in detail this movement that's happening around the world. It's neither pro-communist or anti-communist of young people. It's this new way, living human potential. And you read it, and it seems to follow a lot of these themes. Growth is bad, economic growth is bad, we need to get back to nature, drugs, hallucinogen, mysticism, this intellectual strata. This is all kind of being supported by US intelligence agencies as a method for bringing down socialist countries. And it's important to note, at the same time, right, 1979, Jimmy Carter gave his famous malaise speech, right, in response to the USA is having like its biggest economic downturn since the Second World War under Carter. So Jimmy Carter, as the economy is in its downturn, he gives a speech.
Too many of us now tend to worship self-indulgence and consumption. Human identity is no longer defined by what one does, but by what one owns. But we've discovered that owning things and consuming things does not satisfy our longing for meaning. We've learned that piling up material goods cannot fill the emptiness of lives which have no confidence or purpose. The symptoms of this crisis of the American spirit are all around us.
Basically saying to a public of people who are losing their jobs and losing their homes, oh, you know, you shouldn't be concerned because growth is bad and we care too much about stuff. And on the surface, that sounds like a critique of consumerism. But to a public that's experiencing an economic downturn, that sounds like, you want me to be poor. That's what it sounds like. And At the same time, as there's this economic downturn going on, the new communist movement is kind of in a panic because the whole time they've been saying, oh, well, the working class, they're not in a fighting mood, we have a booming economy. Well, 78, 79, the economy's in a downturn. So the new communist movement goes into kind of a fit of what you might call ultra-left adventurism. The Revolutionary Communist Party very much hates Deng Xiaoping, and so they have a rally at the White House, death to Deng Xiaoping. And hundreds of their members are arrested. A few members of the Revolutionary Communist Party even disrupt a press conference at the White House Rose Garden by Deng Xiaoping and wave the red book at him. And pretty crazy. The Communist Workers' Party, they were operating in North Carolina in a city called Greensboro. And the Ku Klux Klan was operating there as well. So they wrote the Ku Klux Klan a letter announcing that they were going to have a death to the Ku Klux Klan rally. And they said in this letter, we challenge you, Ku Klux Klan, to show your faces, you're cowards, you're weak. It's a very provocative thing that they do. They then have their rally, and the Ku Klux Klan shows up and shoots 5 of them. And it's filmed, it's like live TV, it's happening, and shoots 5 of them on television.
They don't even shoot back?
They didn't bring guns. They agreed not to bring guns to their rally in exchange for their permit. And it's a horrendous incident where 5 communists are murdered in broad daylight by the Ku Klux Klan. It's later revealed that some of the Klansmen that were part of the caravan were members of the Bureau of Alcohol and Firearms and Tobacco and the FBI. And it's an assassination. Now you can argue that maybe they were provocative in writing the Klan a letter, but they were murdered. I mean, they were killed. And the Klansmen are acquitted in court. And it's a horrendous incident. And they're acquitted in court. They said, well, they felt threatened by the communists or something. And it's a horrendous incident, 1979. And shortly after that, the Communist Workers' Party dissolves. For a while, it goes under different names. What's interesting, I think, is that Margaret Chin, who's on the NYC City Council, was the leader of the Communist Workers' Party of New York City for a long time. And that Jean Quan, who was the mayor of Oakland from 2011 to 2015, was also a national leader of the Communist Workers' Party. What's that?
During Occupy, she was mayor.
Yes, and she led the crackdown on Occupy Wall Street. The October League dissolved shortly afterwards in the 80s when China really made clear it didn't want to have an allied party in the United States. The October League, their thing had been that they were the allied Chinese party. China made clear they didn't want to have an allied party, so they dissolved. The Revolutionary Communist Party declared in the early 80s that only the lumpen proletariat are revolutionary, that most workers in the United States are bourgeoisified, and so they had no interest in that. What's also interesting is there was a group called the Democratic Workers' Party, which was like a Maoist feminist group in San Francisco. They began getting, to cut ties with China, but they were getting support from Romania and different socialist countries, and then finally they dissolved in 1984 and merged into what was happening that time, as the new communist movement, all the Maoist groups are collapsing, something called the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee by Michael Harrington and Tom Hayden and others is established. And the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee is starting to say things like, like Leninism doesn't apply to U.S. conditions, and DSA is eventually formed in the mid-'80s. And a lot of the people who found DSA are former members of the new communist movement and Maoist groups who spent a decade in their factory trying to convince their co-workers to be communists, and their co-workers didn't want to hear it. And meanwhile, Deng Xiaoping is presiding over huge amounts of economic growth in China, and at the time he's doing it, he's using communist language to explain what he's doing. He says, the fact that China is poor, has weak economic foundations, and is backward in education, science, and culture means that we have to go through hard struggle. We want to make use of foreign funds and technology to actively expand our foreign trade, but we must rely primarily on our own efforts. We are opposed to those absurd reactionary concepts of impoverished socialism, transition in poverty to a higher stage, and making a revolution in poverty, touted by Lin Biao and the Gang of Four. But we are also opposed to the idea of turning China into a welfare state, because that's impossible. We can only improve our standard of living gradually on the basis of expanded production. And again, a lot of the people that are big supporters of Deng Xiaoping are these intellectuals and students who rioted after the death of Zhou Enlai. And he says, our teachers and scientists are faced with many difficulties in the living conditions which currently need to be overcome. Many intellectuals who are very capable of earning well over 100 yen a month. Given slightly better conditions and living, given slightly better working and living conditions, they would be able to solve many more of the problems for the state and for the people and create immense wealth. And he later goes on to say, at present, some people, especially young people, are skeptical about the socialist system, alleging that socialism is not as good as capitalism. Such ideas need to be firmly corrected. The socialist system is one thing, and the specific way of building socialism is another. Counting from the October Revolution of 1917, the Soviet Union has been engaged in building socialism for 63 years, but still is in no position to boast about how to do it. It is true that we don't have enough experience either, and perhaps it is only now that we have begun in earnest to search for a better road. Nevertheless, the superiority of the socialist system has already been proved, even though it still needs to be displayed in more and better and more convincing ways. In the future, we must, and certainly will, have abundant facts with which to demonstrate that the socialist system is superior to the capitalist system. This superiority should manifest itself in many ways, but first and foremost, it must be revealed in the rate of economic growth and in economic efficiency. Otherwise, there will be no point in trying to blow our own horn.